All right, we are live. Thanks very much. Thanks everybody for joining us today to our June 8th, 2020 Courtenay City Council regular council meeting. We respectfully acknowledge that the land in which we gather is the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation. And I would like just to mention today, it's been a time of heightened emotions, I think, over the last couple of weeks. And I just want to comment on the protests that have happened in the Comox Valley over the weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, all of which I think were, first of all, well attended. I think people really behaved themselves well. But not only that, but they socially distanced, they wore masks. And although some of them were there who were really frustrated, I just want to comment that they weren't looking for revenge. They're really just talking about equality, where they're talking about Black Lives Matter, Indigenous, people of color. I just want to make sure that people know that the city of Courtenay supports these ideas and really want to really comment on one of the things that happened on Friday when Jaruna was talking about how the day before she'd had racial slurs thrown at her, which is absolutely unacceptable in our community. It sounds like that incident may have sorted itself out, but at the end of the day, Courtenay is an inclusive place, and I just want to let people know that that we welcome people, and we want to make sure that everyone knows that we do have a protocol agreement for when incidents like that happen. And I have followed up with our Community Justice Center with Bruce Curtis, and so we're going to see if we can move forward with our protocol agreement as well. So I just really wanted to talk about that a bit. I think it's something that again, we might be a little bit removed here in Courtenay, or feel that we're removed. But if you saw the crowds on the weekend, you'll know that one, it is something that affects a lot of people in our community. But not only that, but there are lots of people out there to support the cause. So I just really want to thank everybody who came out to support. And with that, we'll move into our council meeting.
Sorry, Mayor Wells, can I just speak to that?
Absolutely, Inspector Curvers.
So we got wind of that the day of the event, the reference you're making to, and I actually talked to Bruce Curtis this afternoon. Our members were on scene right away for that. We did arrest somebody for that, and there's actually 4 charges pending. Mischief, cause of disturbance, harassing persons, racial slurs, breach of release order, and some other things. He's one of our taggers as well. So the fellow in question does have a mental health issue, so we're working with that. So it's not going to be referred to restorative justice, so we can't go that road with that. But yeah. I just want to speak to that. We were on top of it right away.
Awesome, and thanks so much. And I didn't know all the ins and outs of it. When I talked to Bruce, I did say that he'll probably want to follow up with the RCMP. But thank you so much for letting us know. And again, I think it's really reassuring that when an incident like that happens, that the RCMP were on site quickly and really dealt with that situation. So again, I think some kudos to our local RCMP folks, again, in a time when there is a lot of anxiety and stress. So thanks very much for that. Getting into our regular meeting, just to talk about COVID-19. Due to the coronavirus COVID-19 emergency, the City of Courtenay, with the authority of Ministerial Order M139, Local Government Meetings and Bylaw Procedures, COVID-19, has implemented changes to its open council meetings. In the midst, or in the interest of public health and safety, public in-person attendance at council meetings will be prohibited until further notice. Council meetings will be presided over by the mayor or acting mayor, with electronic participation by council and staff. Meetings are available for viewing via live web streaming and video recording on the City of Courtenay website, and will start at 4 p.m. during this period. All right, thanks for that. And we'll start off with our adoption of minutes.
Move adoption of the June 1st minutes.
I'll second those.
Excellent. Are there any questions or comments regarding those minutes? See no questions. I'll assume that these are accepted unanimously by council. Thanks very much. Next, we have delegation.
Move receipt.
I'll second.
Mayor,
Yes,
sorry.
Councillor Morin.
thanks, Mayor. Due to the fact that I'm an employee of the John Howard Society, which is the agency that runs the junction, I'll be sitting out of this discussion due
All right.
to potential conflict. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for that. And over to IT staff, are you able to put Councillor Morin on hold?
Don't quite understand the question.
Well, depending on the meeting in Zoom, you can either put them into the waiting room, but we don't have one for these ones. But if you right-clicked on their name, you should be able to put them on hold. And then that basically removes them from the meeting.
Can do.
And then when we're done with this item, we can take them off hold.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have mentioned this before the meeting, but Councillor Morin mentioned it just before, and I forgot to pass it along. I thought I could do it, all right. So moving right along. Did that get moved and seconded? Okay, Councillor Fish second. Okay, and so we can pass it over to Pamela Willis. Chris Anderson, yeah.
Hello, I'm Mayor Wells. Councillors Cole Hamilton, Frisch, Helian, McCollum, Wendy sitting out, and Councillor Theos. It's great to be here. My name is Pamela Willis. I'm the manager of Comox Valley Senior Support, and my colleague, Chris Anderson, manager of the Comox Valley Better at Home program, is here today, as well as two Kiwanis Village residents. And so we have Sandy Jordan and Karen Hope. We are representing by request what residents of Kiwanis Village who have felt serious negative impacts to their well-being since the opening of the junction. Some of these residents were to be in council chambers in March had we been there, and you would hear from them. Instead, Sandy Jordan and Karen Hope will be reading the impact statements they have read. Others have chosen to remain anonymous and didn't feel safe writing impact statements for safety reasons. We want to be clear from the start that the actions that we are taking are not about closing the junction. This is not a NIMBY reaction, and I hope that you will all listen to that and really hear what these impact statements have to say. This is a group of people who have not felt heard or care about, and they want this to change. Safety is a major theme of the people we are supporting. Kiwanis Village residents no longer feel safe in their homes. They no longer feel safe in their neighborhood. They have endured theft, verbal and physical assaults, intrusions into their personal spaces, and nighttime noises that disrupt sleep. They are regularly witnessing alarming behaviors that include drug dealing, sexual activity, violence, drug-facilitated psychoses, and individuals who are passed out and non-responsive. But it's best if you hear directly from residents, and so I'm going to turn this over to Sandy Jordan and Karen Hope, and then you'll hear from Chris Anderson as she wraps this up for us. So thank you.
I do that. Hi, I'm Karen. This is a statement from KD, a 90-year-old resident at Kiwanis Village. With the arrival of the junction, there is a constant activity, noise, and increased vehicle traffic on the junction property and surrounding areas. Since I live directly opposite, I get to experience it all. There's open drug dealing, people on bikes riding around all day and night, and a car often parked on the street in front of the junction where junction residents visit. The junction is not a good neighbor, and I'm disappointed that I am subject to this. I do have a document that states there was supposed to be a good neighbor policy in place. and that all residents would be informed of this policy and expected to accept and follow this policy as a condition of their housing. But I have not seen this policy, and I do not know if it exists or has been enforced. I once used to be able to enjoy my patio, but I cannot even use it anymore. It has been very detrimental loss to the quality of my life. I do not open my drapes anymore. I would like to see some control over nighttime activities and noise so I could sleep. Now I have something from another client, 69-year-old client, DS. I am fearful for my safety and always carry dog spray for my protection. I have strangers come around my rental unit regularly and sometimes late at night. Why are they here? I'm 69 years old and I'm scared of having an encounter with one of these people. I'm experiencing sleepless nights and worn out mentally and physically. This is no way to live. I'm angry. Sandy?
Hi, everyone. My first impact statement I'm reading from initials JH. Been a resident in the Kiwanis Village for just under 2 years, and since the junction's opened, I've had a lot of sleepless nights, usually in the middle of the night when I hear shouting and swearing and fighting. And when this happens, I can't get back to sleep. I'm up all night. Been accosted 3 times on Menzies Avenue by Junction's residents wanting money or cigarettes. And when I don't give them anything, they walk away cursing me. I've followed them to see where they go, and it's right back into the junction. I now carry dog spray with me. I've also been intimidated by drug dealers who sit outside the junction quite often. Unfortunately, I no longer feel safe walking in my neighborhood area and have to drive to the air park for my walks. And this statement is from me, Sandy Jordan. The Kiwanis Village has 66 residents between the ages of 55 and 94 years. Some of them residing here for more than 30 years. We've endured many of life's challenges, some of us losing family or mental health issues, and we've developed compassion for ourselves and for others. Since the junction's opened, there's a sense of fear because of drug-related activities and disturbing behaviors witnessed and experienced on Pidcock Avenue and 8th Street. I've had major surgery over a year ago, and my physicians have advised me to walk daily as part of my recovery, whereas I used to walk daily in the neighborhood. I no longer feel safe in doing so. As a representative of the Kiwanis Village residents on the Junction Community Advisory Committee, I receive calls from Kiwanis Village residents reporting that they've experienced tapping on their windows at night, people trying their doors at night, hearing screaming and expletives at all times of the day at night. Very upsetting to hear these elderly neighbors so upset with what they are experiencing regularly. The main impacts on me include increased anxiety, worry and concern about my safety and the safety of my village neighbors, and loss of sleep, awaking to any noise. And I have an update that I just created in the last few days. Several Junction residents have been frequenting the Kiwanis Village property and at times spending the night, including a Junction resident who is seen dealing drugs on Pidcock Avenue and 8th Street. Individuals from the Junction and those who hang out around the Junction have been sorting through recycling bins outside our social hall and the dumpster on our property. Noise from the Junction is increasingly bothersome to Kiwanis Village residents, from vehicles frequenting the Junction without mufflers, Junction residents gathering outside at night, like at midnight to 4 a.m., loud voices, profanity, loud music from the Junction building day and night. Repeated calls are made to the Junction to report the noise and disruption with varying outcomes. Sometimes staff come out to disperse the gathering, sometimes not. Sometimes there's a reduction in noise, sometimes not. All of these reports from Kiwanis Village residents have stated that they continue to feel unsafe and continue to see a decline in their quality of life in this neighborhood. Karen?
Hi, this is my impact statement. Noise, I've been at Kiwanis Village for 4 years. I'm the senior at Kiwanis. And it's really been a challenge for all of the residents there. Our personal safety really continues to be an issue for all of us. We're all very afraid. We're all woken up 3 to 5 times a night. There's usually at least 3 different people at the junction that are playing their music at the same time. We'll get a hold of the junction. Nothing really is done. We have phoned the non-emergency numbers of the police department, but nothing really can be done. The other thing that has been happening is each night, or actually back to that, the one thing we had to retaliate, unfortunately, with my 90-year-old neighbor and I, we put opera music on and turned it up full blast and left it on for like about 8 hours. And the only thing it did do is just push them into the bush, but at least we had some peace and quiet and could use our patios. You know, each night there's tents that get put up. Every day and every night there's urination, defecation at the railway tracks. It never stops. It's very embarrassing. You just don't even want to have company over. I mean, that's another thing for now. Myself, I'm frustrated because I really don't feel like I'm being heard and nobody's taking this seriously. Thank you.
And I have one last impact statement from an anonymous person. I live in the Kiwanis Village and I'm speaking out because I have been negatively impacted by the activities associated with the junction. I'm choosing to remain anonymous for safety reasons. I've experienced or witnessed theft of personal property from my patio, strangers peering through my windows, rapping on my window, attempts to open my door, sleep disturbances, vulgar language, yelling, fighting, open drug dealing, sexual activity around the bus shelter, public use of drugs and alcohol, garbage strewn around the neighborhood, including used needles, being verbally threatened when I told intruders that they were on private property. The impacts for this anonymous individual is I don't feel safe in my home or neighborhood. I have to walk since it's my main way of getting around, but I feel afraid and no longer take leisurely walks in my neighborhood. Inability to sleep at nights, which leaves me without energy the next day. I use my patio and outside areas very seldom. I used to enjoy my patio space. I keep windows and doors locked at all times. Thank you.
Karen, there's Karen Hope. There's one more excerpt. There's MH. Did you want to read that?
We're out of time. I think we're out of time here.
Are we? Okay.
I've got another minute on my.
I'm going to do a 1-minute little wrap up then.
Okay.
Just in closing, my name's Chris, and I've been working with this group of incredible people at Kiwanis over the last number of months as they came to us looking for help. The residents of Kiwanis want to live peacefully and with respectful neighbors, and they assume that many junction neighbors want the same. And as you've heard, elders' safety and health has been compromised, and they want assurances that their concerns will be addressed. The city and the John Howard Society promised to provide housing for those who made a choice to work towards living a healthy, stable life, which is in the documents that were given out to the public. The John Howard Society promised they'd respond directly to any concerns in a timely manner, but this has not been the case. And they actually responses denying that these things are happening. Junction residents I have spoken to has told me that they signed program agreements outlining expectations, how they are to live there and be cooperative, and that there's a 3-step process in place to resolve resident disruptions. But over the past 14 months, Kiwanis residents have noticed that it's often the same junction residents disrupting the neighborhood over and over, leading them to assume that this process isn't working, this 3-step process to be able to, evict people as a last resort after they've been worked with over 3 periods of time to get their behavior in place when they're screaming and yelling at 3 in the morning and waking up neighbors. The junction has a community advisory committee, and one of the mandates prioritizes safety and security for citizens to live peacefully, free from harm and conduct respectful of others. So this is their own mandate. They acknowledge that individuals have the freedom to act as they please as long as the actions are lawful and do not disrupt or harm others. So residents of Kiwanis are low-income elders, many with health problems. All of them have no alternative affordable housing available to them. The city supported this project to be in this location. The city has the interests of its citizens at heart. And Kiwanis residents would like the city to have a leadership role and in trying to make concrete changes, support the Kiwanis seniors and the other neighbors and the junction to make concrete changes in this neighborhood. The documents are in place. There is a neighborhood agreement. As far as we know, nobody's seen it. There are these agreements with all of the people that live there. There already is a description of the role of the Community Advisory Council for the junction. Those things need to be followed. As far as we can tell, they're just on paper. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much for your presentation and for everybody that spoke today. I really appreciate it. I know it can be a lot to do this, so it's very much appreciated. I do have some questions here, so Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. And thank you to Chris and Pamela and Karen and Sandy as well. You know, hearing these stories is quite saddening. Kiwanis Village, of course, in my mind, is a gem in our community, and I've always been really impressed with how strong the community is in that neighborhood. So I am really sad to hear these stories. I actually I don't know if I have a question for the delegation, because I think that was quite clear on what's happening in the neighborhood. I was wondering if I might just throw some questions out for council and staff, and I know we have the inspector here with us. So, you know, having to do with this neighborhood agreement, and my understanding was that there was a community advisory committee being struck, and I'm just wondering if those have met and how those sorts of things are going. And I know Councillor Hillian was involved to some degree. Perhaps he would comment on that as well at some point. Yeah, and for Inspector Curvers, if it's possible to bring him into the discussion, does that sound reasonable, Mayor?
I think he may have some very valuable insights. So if he feels comfortable, yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, you know, what the RCMP's experience is in that neighborhood, and if things are being reported, and if things are being discovered when they show up, and all the rest.
I sent a document to Wendy, kind of outlining the junction and the Kiwanis, and I can kind of speak to it now if you like. I don't know if everybody has access to that.
I got one printed off. Wendy, is that in the cloud or email?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. It was posted on OwnCloud and also emailed to council and senior leadership staff prior to the meeting commencing.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
So if you're actually looking at the document at the top of the page 1, it shows you the number of files for the last fiscal year. So from last April till this April, it's pretty up and down, and it's consistent. We're averaging, you know, between 13 and 20 files per month at that location. So these are reported offenses. So we're not accounting for the ones that are not reported. And that's kind of the basis of the discussions. These things have to be reported to us for us to acknowledge it and to actually respond to it. So if you look at just April to April comparisons, like in 2019, you can see cause of disturbance was 4 files, theft of bicycles 2, and then you go down property, and then you compare to this April, we only went up a few files. So it's generic. The drug dealing and the other activities, these are things that need to be reported to us. We've done projects at the junction and been very successful. Once we show up, they scatter, and we need the evidence to support charges. So there's a number of ways we can do that. One of them is, you know, more visibility, which we can do, but we can't be there all the time. The other part is I can ask officers to do the report writing and park in front of the building. So that'll be a deterrent, and they'll move along. The nighttime activities, that we need to get that reported. Like officers are on all night. We have 24 hours staff. If there's something going on, call us, use the 911. I'll talk to our dispatch center and make sure that these are prioritized a little bit better, because certain calls are prioritized. I've discussed this before, because everything's prioritized 1, 2, 3, and 4. If it ends up at a 3 and 4 priority, it's not going to get attention right away because we have other pressing matters like assaults and domestics that we're going to attend to. But if I can talk to upstairs, our dispatchers, and try and get that so it's prioritized maybe as a 2, and then we can get some attention to that, and then you get more response. So,
thank you for that. Sorry.
I just want to go on to the second page if you still have it there. And you can see just the file count from going from, there's a lot of zeros in there. Like January, we had no calls. This April, we've only had 2 calls to Kiwanis. So the second page is all Kiwanis files for the village. And this shows me that it's underreported. So we need that dialogue from the community there to call that into us so we can respond to it.
And Inspector, oh, hang on one second, Inspector Kerber. So if we're looking at page number 2 that has those lower numbers from Kiwanis Village, is that just if a car rolls out there, or is that even just if a call comes in?
That's just a general occurrence. So it can be from anything from A to Z. Trespassers, cause of disturbance, loud noises, all the whole gambit. Right. So it's obviously underreported. So we document everything. That's just our nature. So if we can get the community to call us, doesn't matter if it's 3 in the morning, 2 in the morning, call us and we'll try and get to it. I'll talk to upstairs and see if we can prioritize the files a little bit better and maybe get some attention to this.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest maybe this is also something that Citizens on Patrol might be interested in, and could encourage people from the neighborhood to join Citizens on Patrol. I'm not suggesting the Kiwanis Village people themselves necessarily have the time for that, but there are a lot of other people in this community probably have similar concerns. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah, we have, I'll talk to Mana Taragni and maybe Citizens on Patrol and Block Watch. We can approach the community and see if they have an interest in that.
And Mike, sorry to put you on the spot. What is the phone number to call in and report something like a disturbance or?
Well, at night, it's just a straight the 911 call.
Yeah.
After 4:30, pardon me, I'm going to say 16:30, that's my hours. 4:30 in the afternoon, all calls will go straight upstairs. So they're actually screened. So you have to say the right things. Like when you're talking to them, you got a male in my property, he's rummaging through garbage. I'm afraid, I can't go outside. That'll catch your attention. They're going to try and screen you and you got to say the right things. And that way you can get prioritized in the call center.
Thank you for that. Thanks, Mayor.
And Councillor Frisch, you'd also asked about the community advisory, I think there was a note in here that Sandy is on that committee. Does that sound right, Sandy?
Yes,
that's correct. Can you give it? And can you just give us a little bit of feedback, like how often you've met and sort of how those meetings go?
Yes, we have met. It was struck, the committee was struck in May of 2019, so several months after the junction opened and was occupied. We met, I believe it's 5 times in 2019 and only met once in 2020. There was a January scheduled meeting and it was canceled due to snow. And there was a February 13th meeting, which was the last time we met. And then the COVID situation arose. We have not met by Zoom. I wanted to address the comment or the inquiry from Councillor Frisch about the neighborhood agreement. There is some kind of agreement that the residents of the junction must agree to in terms of their conduct in the neighborhood. But the neighborhood agreement that we were led to believe was going to be put in place prior to at the time of the junction opening is not the neighborhood agreement that we all enjoy that has the agreement with the city with Salvation Army. They have a 3 or 4 page agreement that was struck in 2012, I believe it was, whereby it's an agreement with Salvation Army, the city of Courtenay, and the neighborhood to have their clients, as they call them, guests, as they call them at Salvation Army, abide by in terms of their conduct in the neighborhood. There is no such document that's certainly not an agreement with the city and with this neighborhood with respect to the residents of the junction. And I, further to that, I wanted to, Mayor, you had asked me about the how do those meetings go? There is a terms of reference that was outlined when the committee first began. And in my experience, those terms of reference have not been, we haven't been aligned with it as a committee. There's a lot of informality. Anything I report from Kiwanis Village residents, I represent 66 people here, is barely noted. There actually hasn't been meeting minutes. There's been meeting notes, which is done by the chair of the Community Advisory Committee meeting, which is also the manager of the junction, that are meeting notes, but they're very lean, if you put it that way. Anybody that might send their regrets and not attend a meeting would be hard pressed to find out what was discussed in the meeting by looking at the meeting notes. And I've encouraged and requested that the committee realign themselves with the terms of reference. And that has not been addressed adequately in my mind thus far. So perhaps we have a meeting set for June 25th. And it will be done mostly by Zoom, I believe. And I believe it's on the agenda. So that's what I can answer to that. And I'm happy to answer any other questions about the Community Advisory Committee meeting.
All right, and I appreciate that that feedback. And I do see that Chris has put her hand up. Did you want to speak to this as well, Chris?
I just wanted to say, in response to the discussion about police response, I think that, you know, police response can be useful if there's something, if there's a crime being committed at that very time and people call in at that very time and there's a response. However, part of the problem with living in Kiwanis, what I've heard from the residents, is that having police, it's part of the whole cycle of the disruption, is waking up in the night, calling police, calling the junction, then waiting for the police, then maybe sirens come, and your whole night is disrupted. And it's sometimes it's necessary. It's a reaction to a problem. And I think preventions to these problems, such as the guidelines being followed that are in place at the John Howard Society for residents to agree, you know, the resident agreements, the community advisory, all those things being in place, you know, these type of projects can be run in many different ways. There's many ways to run supported housing projects. And when things aren't going well, then you try a different way. And it's difficult when there's a denial that these things are happening, I guess. And so the frustration level has kind of ramped up to a point of people, you know, often don't call the police because they just feel tired. They're just fed up with it. And so I think it needs to be worked on many levels. BC Housing needs to be involved. The management of the housing needs to be involved. I mean, there's a board member, John Howard board member on city council, you know, he should be working with his board to address these things. These things can be addressed on many different structural levels that can create a supported housing place that's a great place. It doesn't need to be assumed that it's going to be a bad place. So that's all I want to say.
All right, thanks for that. I appreciate it. And Councillor Theos.
Thanks, Mayor. And thank you to Chris and Sandy for bringing the impact statements forward to information that I've been hearing quite a bit. And, you know, even as of yesterday, I heard a couple residents of Kiwanis Village just expressing the stress levels of what they're living through. and take it very much to heart, because I've known many of these people that are living in the Kiwanis Village for many years, and they're legitimately living in fear. This is an example of rushing a decision forward because there was an opportunity, and that to me has so many holes potentially and room for complete failure. And if we don't turn this ship around on this issue, it was absolute failure. It's so often, if you suggest that in the moment of trying to do something good for a group of people to help their lives progress, if the end result is you're damaging many other lives that are casualties of that decision, we failed. We've absolutely failed. And the time is when you're talking about when as elected officials we're talking about potential pitfalls and dangers, then there's a group of society that says, oh, you're cruel, you're mean-spirited, you're heartless. This is an outcome that could happen when things aren't done right. Very worrisome, very worrisome. Real actions need to be taken. And there's got to be consequences for the people that are behaving like this. And the organization needs to step up and acknowledge people's feelings, people's views. Those are real views and real feelings. Regardless of whether there might be some difference of how it's outlaid, when someone expresses their views, people that are between 60 to 90 years old, those are not to be disregarded. Those are their feelings deep down inside. And, I feel for the people in the Kiwanis Village. So I am very much in favor of saying, let's right this ship. It needs to be done. It was poorly brought forward. The provincial government was dangling an opportunity in front of us. We gave up a real nice piece of property to try to help and progress people's lives. And as I said, the end result is almost the exact opposite for many other lives. So this cannot continue. As we're going to see in the next report, crime in our community this year has escalated dramatically. Drug dealing escalated dramatically. I mean, other than cannabis, which was removed from that list, but everything else through the moon. Things need to change. We're getting worse. I'm just really disappointed. And yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Councillor Theos. And as I recall, when we were looking at this project, and yeah, the timelines were relatively tight. But I think one of the miscommunications early on was the promise of a community advisory group, and the idea that would be functioning prior to the building actually opening, so that there would be that ability to build sort of community trust. But as we found out, because there was no funding for that, that meant that they had to actually wait until after the building was actually even open and they had a cash flow before they could do those things. And so, I think that really when Councillor Theos talks about it starting on the wrong foot, again, great intentions, but obviously there's things that we can do to make it better. Councillor McCollum.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to everyone who came to us today and highlighted just how difficult it is living near the junction right now. It's very troubling. Many of the things that were described on many different levels, any of them on their own would be a cause for concern, but hearing the exhaustive list of what residents are facing on a regular basis it just really highlights how important it is that council put their minds together and figure out some concrete solutions. I also really appreciate that many of you did point to constructive possibilities and gaps where things are being missed. And I just want to express that I think there is work for us to do there. I think that we could work towards finding a means of getting a neighborhood agreement in place. It's obviously something that should have been done sooner, and it at least gives us something to go back to. We have it, like you said, with another facility in your neighborhood, but we've done it elsewhere in the city too, so it's not a new idea. What else was I going to point to? I'm encouraged to hear that the police are going to make this a bigger priority and possibly just have a police car come by when they're writing reports. I think maybe a visible police presence would be helpful. It also highlights that perhaps the intention of the junction of helping people into stable housing is not meeting its goal when you know, the residents that have moved in there and are looking for stability and looking to improve themselves are also sharing a facility with people who are not in that place and are really not there to do that work. So I've heard everything that you guys have had to say today, and I look forward to looking at what the city can do to support this process. So thank you very much.
Excellent. And Councillor Hillian.
Thanks very much, Mayor. First of all, I just want to, for the record, state that it's correct. I do serve on the board of the John Howard Society. I have for the past year and a half. I wasn't involved when the junction was built or when the organization got the contract. I'm hard pressed to see, it's been suggested by somebody on the chat that it's a conflict of interest for me to take part in this meeting, and I'm hard pressed to see how that's the case. If somebody can clarify that for me, I'll certainly listen to it. I did want to acknowledge that Councillor Cole Hamilton and myself met with residents of Kiwanis Village last year. We heard concerns. The mayor, you will remember that we actually organized a meeting with BC Housing afterwards to talk about the concerns that we heard. We were successful in convincing them to move their smoking area, which it had been noted was a source of some of the noise. As a result of that intervention, they moved it to behind the building. Councillor Frisch and I met with other residents in that neighborhood to talk about concerns they had about activity along the tracks, which weren't necessarily junction residents, but you know, we were aware that for some time that area has been an avenue for some illegal activity. I've also met with other residents in that neighborhood who had concerns prior to the junction being built with regards to the Salvation Army shelter and residents there and disruptions that they were causing in the neighborhood. So I'm saying this not to in any way minimize the very real concerns that we've heard today, which deeply sadden me, that in an attempt to get people off the street and into better housing and hopefully repairing their lives, we've caused this sort of disruption to the neighborhood. I know we've asked a lot of this neighborhood in over many years with the various services that exist, and it's come at a cost. And I certainly think we need to work with the community to do what we can to improve the situation. I do note that in the material that was submitted to council, I don't think it was mentioned in the presentations, but there was a note where I believe they were asking for a liaison council member to be appointed to work with Kiwanis Village on these issues. And I know that I'm sure council will speak about that subsequent to this meeting today. And I'm sure that we'll be willing to work with Kiwanis in whatever way we can to help improve this situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian. I appreciate that. And Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you everyone who spoke today. Karen, I've spoken to you a few times about this, and Sandy, I don't think it's there, but we've spoken as well. And certainly hearing the stories in person, and I think I recognized a few of the individuals you spoke about when you read the stories out loud. And it's hard to hear that this continues to be so difficult for people in their days. I know that all these materials were prepared a few months ago before a meeting in March when we were all supposed to meet. And I'm just curious to know whether you've noticed any change since that time, whether there's been any improvement in communications with John Howard Society, or I guess particularly that we've already heard from Inspector Curvers about ways that it may be possible to receive more police response. But I'm wondering what kind of responses you're continuing to get from John Howard Society staff when you do call to express concerns. I don't know who wants to take that.
Karen, are you there?
Yeah, I am here.
Maybe Karen?
Yes, sometimes some of the residents, we do call over to the junction. Mostly we get told there's absolutely nothing that can be done.
That's the most frequent response?
That's the most frequent response. There's nothing we can do. And we'll say, could you come out here and hear this? Because there'll be like 3 different buildings that have got music blaring, all different kinds out of them. And it'll go on for hours and hours and hours. And most people are really, really afraid to phone the police. I'm really trying to encourage them. I'm actually going to be joining Sandy and this June on that other committee and representing my side of Kiwanis Village, and she'll represent sort of her side where she lives in Kiwanis Village. So we're going to be a team, which is kind of nice as well. And just stand beside each other. I mean, I was somebody who worked in the community healthcare for 22 years, you know, so I'd like to see some kind of solutions. That's what I'd really like to be a part of. And anytime we try to communicate with the junction, we just don't get any response mostly.
I'll quickly add
Until
that.
a couple months ago, you couldn't even leave a message or nobody did answer the phone, but then they did start answering. When it was brought to their attention, they put in an answering machine. So, you know,
Maybe I could add
we'll know more about this.
Yeah, maybe I could add one thing, and that is a common response to calls to the junction is that an investigation was done and there's no problem. Very disempowering for people to be constantly dismissed.
Okay. I can certainly understand that. That seems like an area of communication that work should be put into in terms of trying to improve it. I hope from the meeting today that you can take back to your conversations with residents that you've had a chance to look from the police side, that you've heard from the inspector, person in charge of the Comox Valley Detachment, and they understand your concerns, and they are encouraging you to do whatever you can to keep reporting, to at least know that that line of communication is strong. And maybe there's something we can be doing to make for stronger lines of communication between all of you and the John Howard Society, because it sounds like that's an area that needs repair as a relationship. And I just wanted to ask about, there were a couple of concrete measures you'd suggested. One was a fence in the front yard of the junction, and the other one was the bus shelter. And I'm hoping that those are things that we can help to move forward by discussing them with John Howard, and the bus shelter, I imagine, would be BC Transit through the regional district. But certainly, those are a couple
I didn't read them. We only had so much time, so it was really hard to. But there is the people that live right across from the bus shelter and right beside it. It really is a challenge. There's a lot of drug dealing, people sleeping in it every night. A lot of prostitution. It never ends. I mean, it's every day, it's all the time. One of the residents that has to go over at 7 o'clock at night, example, she comes over to our side and locks up our laundry room. I mean, she's at the point, she's got a safety device with her now because she has to walk by the people that are there. And you don't really want to engage with those people. You know, we really are, it's really hard. And then they did put a garbage can there and clean it up somewhat, but I mean, it's a daily thing. It never stops and it never goes away. You know, like we get woken up. I get woken up 3 to 5 times a night. I never get to sleep through the night, ever. And that's been going on for 3 years. I live on the corner of Menzies and Pidcock. So if we can come up with anything, you know, it would be, I don't know what the solution is, but we're certainly happy to work with anybody, anytime.
Speaking for myself, I've heard what you're saying, and I can see the toll that it's taking on people. And as Councillor Hillian said, we'll talk about getting sort of a council response. And
That'd be
I'm
great.
glad, I appreciate you giving us a couple of items that we can think about how to best work on, like if something can be done about the fence and the bus shelter. But thank you for your honesty. Those weren't easy stories to tell, and I just appreciate took some courage. So thank you very much.
No, thank you all for all that you do.
Yeah, well, and you know, and I know we had hoped to talk to you guys earlier, and then I think you were getting scheduled just as the pandemic took hold. So you guys are our first real delegation. So so it has been a priority for us to see how we can make this happen. So again, really want to appreciate you know, starting this dialogue at this level, and hopefully again we'll I think you'll have support from council. Just to touch on that thing around Councillor Hillian also being a director, generally in these types of situations, the only time there's been real issues is if there's financial decisions to be made. But I believe the provincial government has actually fixed that quirk in the system, just because in a lot of communities, people are on multiple boards and on council and stuff. So again, and I think Councillor Moran, just being an employee, she felt that put her in a bigger conflict because of being an employee. So, but being a director is something that we do get legal advice and training on. So rest assured, it is something that we put our minds to. Councillor Theos.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate it. Following up on the concrete measures that all three of you ladies actually eloquently brought forward, and as Councillor McCollum mentioned, we're very grateful that you brought forward those concrete measures. Sometimes, you know, people talk about problems and express the problems, and you did that extremely well. But at the same time, don't come forward with potential solutions. And hearing those potential solutions is very valuable. So the one that I'm going to also highlight is again the one that Councillor McCollum did mention, and I thank Councillor Will Cole Hamilton for bringing up the other two that are going to be two probably of many that we're going to all brainstorm to come up with. But the one I'm thinking really needs to have the teeth is that good neighbor agreement, and that good neighbor agreement needs to be revisited. And the John Howard Society needs to take that seriously, and it's going to have to be taken to the point where we might even have to have a discussion with the police on how there may be elements that that they may be involved in also. So this is going to have to be a very comprehensive good neighbor agreement that's going to have teeth. So that, and you know, the reality is that we've actually we've received letters from public members, not just the Kiwanis Village and neighboring people, but public member that had a child that was living at the junction, and this lady was saying that she is told firsthand drug dealing and other activities are actively going on. So it's not just the Kiwanis Village residents and surrounding. We certainly have heard information from at least one person that has someone living inside as a resident that's a family member that activity is going on. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's some very, very good people we've met, and they are really good neighbors, and they're very afraid. They live in there and they are very afraid, and they're afraid to speak up.
Yeah,
I certainly agree with you on that too.
Yeah, and I think the contract that we may be talking about is the one that the residents sign as part of living there. In terms of the good neighbor, I think that's where that community advisory group, those kinds of things, that's where that hits. Now, Inspector Curvers, I saw you took your mic off. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate all the comments from everybody, and I want to commit a resource to these meetings. So if you include us in any kind of agenda or any meetings, then I'll get somebody there to participate.
There is.
Excellent. Well, it's serendipitous that you're on this meeting today, so that's much appreciated. I don't see any further questions at this point. I think we've had a relatively fulsome conversation. Again, really want to thank those that spoke today. Again, we know this is a difficult situation, and it's not going to be solved overnight, but we do want to commit to you, I think, as council. I'll speak on behalf of council, but I think this is something that we all take very seriously, and we want to make sure it gets rectified as soon as possible, but in the best way possible as well. So with that, we'll say goodbye to you guys, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. And if you guys could just leave the meeting, and then we'll just continue on, unless you want to stay and watch, but it's not going to be nearly as exciting. All right, thanks for that. So again, being a delegation, I'm going to assume a unanimous receipt unless somebody is not in favor of that. All right, so I think we're good there. And moving on to CAO and Legislative Services, we do have Inspector Mike Curver's report.
And are we bringing Wendy back?
Oh yeah, I believe she should be back.
Yeah.
I believe she's been taken off of hold, but I don't know that she knows that she's off of hold. But there she is.
There you are.
Fantastic. And just in time, because I believe this is your motion here.
My moving receipt then of
Yes, please.
these two, the presentation on the year-over-year report then. Thank you.
And I'll second that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And over to you, Inspector Curvers.
So I sent over two documents. The one, the year-to-year review is you can kind of peruse at your own leisure. Kind of goes into the stats and the amount of calls and the differences in sorry, I'm working two mice here, so I got to go back and forth, so bear with me. So the first document is just the kind of the comparison from year to year, and it's respect to the Comox Valley. It doesn't signal out Courtenay in itself, but last year we had over 20,000 calls for service, which we responded to. Then it's broken down to Courtenay, Comox, Cumberland, and the rural areas. So that kind of, you can kind of look at that at your own leisure. And if you have questions, we can go through that. The report I want to go through today is the Courtenay overview. So we've broken it down into stats, and I don't want to bore you with stats, but some of these are from a higher level, and you're going to just see kind of the overlay of where the calls for service are and what they are. It's going to be very quick.
Excuse me for interrupting, Inspector Curvers. Mr. Mayor, is there any way these can go up on the screen so that people watching are able to see the presentation?
In real time. Excellent question. I do have that on my screen. So just give me 1 second. I could probably share that if you want, Inspector Curvers, and then you just tell me when to go to the next page. Now these are numbered, which is one of the things I love more than almost anything else. So let me just see if I can.
It's the smaller document, not the colored version, just the black and white one.
Black and white. Oh, I might not have that one in front of me. Now the black and white one that I had.
I sent you one was for the Kiwanis and for the junction, and the second one was just a Courtenay overview.
Right, and I don't think I have those in digital form just yet. So I'm not sure that I can share that out.
No problem. Thanks all the same.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I apologize for that. I sent all that stuff over. So I know there's a way to do it because I've done it with different Zoom programs where we can get that on. But I'll just kind of speak to it quickly, and then when you get a chance to look at it, and if you have questions later on, you can just phone me or email or whatever version you want to get a hold of me there. So top 10 file types. So I've broken this down into statistics, which Mayor Wells likes. So we got suspicious occurrences, which is 1,483. We have traffic complaints is 945. A cause of disturbance, 805. Unspecified assistance, 640, and that accounts for a whole gamut of things we respond to. Mental Health Act calls for service is 470. 911 false abandoned calls, 459. Property found, which is basically no response, but we create a file because we have to try and find the owner of that property, so we take that on. And then there's mischief. Mischief comes in the graffiti and the tagging. So there's 436 files. Property lost, those are people reporting things missing out of their cars and losing wallets and credit cards and things like that, and false alarms. So that accounts for about 44% of our total count of files. The Courtenay file count itself is 14,827. So 44% of that is just what I spoke to. Those are the calls for service we respond to. But I'll break it down a little further. For the break and enters, for business break and enter, there was 103 reported last year. For residential break and enter, there was 91, and other B&E is 76, and that's to trailers and different type of scenarios. So that's significant. Again, with the prolific offenders, a lot of calls correspond to a few people. So next slide I'll go to is auto theft. Theft under 5,000. So we categorize theft of auto into plus 5,000 or minus 5,000. And that's what it does in a criminal code as well. So theft of auto under 5,000 are 21, theft over 5,000 is 10 files. Theft of truck over 5,000 is 8 files. Theft of motorcycle under 5,000 is 7 files. Theft of other vehicle, ATVs and things like that is 7. Theft of truck under 5,000 is 5. Another vehicle under 5,000 is 4, and theft of motorcycle under 5,000 is 1. So it's not that significant in comparison to the global picture. And then it's difficult to talk to these because they're basically diagrams with circles and dots on it to show where the file count is and where it actually concentrated. I can tell you from here, it's a lot of it is the core of Cliff Avenue, and then General, and kind of around Superstore, our area is significant. And if I go to break it down a little further, you know, the business score is going to get hit a little bit because of the beanies and the mischief and the alarms. Break and enters, there's no real rhyme or pattern for that. They're all over the map, but a lot of it is, if you go a couple blocks off of Cliff Avenue, you're going to see a majority of those, and in the business community. And auto theft, again, it's mostly along Cliff Avenue and the areas that are less popular, where people aren't walking as much, as there's not a lot of traffic, foot traffic and otherwise. And theft from is just the core, and then up Ryan and around Superstore, and basically all of Courtenay is kind of affected, the more dense areas. Mischief, again, most of the stuff, if you see the picture, the diagrams, it's going to be along the main corridor. And the Mental Health Act calls are all over the place, depending on where our clients are. We get a lot of calls through the Washington apartments because, as you know, they house a lot of clients there. So we deal with a lot of that. Along Ryan Road and up to the hospital, because patients are walking away from their treatment, or we're getting calls from the hospital. We get calls from the public or from concerned family members where we have to deal with scenarios with patients having addiction or mental health issues. So we deal with a lot of that. And that's it for the slides. It's unfortunate you don't have it in front of you, but when you see it, you'll visualize what I was talking about. So I did want to talk a few things. One of them is the priorities. I know the annual performance plan from my end is due. I have to get the priorities in line. I know I sent a copy over and from last year, I kind of just cut and paste from last year, but those can be built onto whatever you want. One is traffic and road safety, and the other is crime reduction. Now, if you want to do something on the drug component or something else, then we need to discuss that, and I'll just build it, and then you guys can review it, and we can go back and forth until you're satisfied with what you have. So I have the ability to manipulate entry into that document and decide what you decide on for your priorities.
And on that, I think Ms. Richta would probably be able to send you last year's list, which unless council wanted to change it up significantly, but we could look at that at some point in the near future and just make sure that that it does make good sense, and then send that off. But I know for the previous 4 years, it was pretty constant or consistent, I think, and covered things like domestic abuse, et cetera, which are encapsulated, I think, in the list that you gave, but just kind of give a little bit more detail, I guess, is probably the best thing. And all of council did have access to those files. It was just, I was thinking it was in one file and it was in another file. Otherwise,
yeah.
Had I been ready, a little bit more ready, I would have been able to bring it up. But you're over halfway through by the time I was fully prepared. So my apologies.
No problem. So the two I mentioned were the two ones from last year, was traffic and crime reduction. Crime reduction focuses in on the property crimes, prolific offenders like the B&Es and the theft from motor vehicles. If you want something with like a drug angle, like enforcement or proactive work, then we can build that into that. It's all what the city wants and what they want to put in there. So I have to kind of leave that with you to decide, because we can build it, and then those are the priorities we can work on.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. And I think what we'll do is we'll maybe send out the letter, because I'm pretty sure we were looking at it earlier, and we'll send it out to council, get some feedback, and then we can chat about it at our next council meeting and send it off, I think. Mr. Richta?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I do have the letter and the document already prepared for signature.
Oh, well, there you go.
Awesome.
So,
that's great.
More prepared than we thought.
Yeah, so I can open up for questions, but I do have some good things to talk about.
Yeah.
These are, they'll be coming out in a PSA shortly, but I'll give you a bit of a heads up. The Coffee Love Bug shooting, we've laid charges. So we have 11 counts against an individual. That was a lot of hard work from our major crime side. The plainclothes side doing a lot of good work. So we've kind of wrapped that up. That's with Crown Council. And then all charges are approved. So information stored so I can talk about it. The second one is the machete. We're actually preparing a report to Crown Council for that. So there are probably some charges pending from that as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that update, and really appreciate it. I mean, I think if we look over the last year, those two incidents are certainly the two most significant, I think, from a crime and almost a shock to the community. So it's really great to hear that the RCMP have been sort of beeling away, getting the work done so that, again, it can go to Crown Council. I know there's a lot of work that goes into that. So I think our community is very appreciative of all that effort, and hopefully that bears some fruit going forward. So thanks for that update. It's very much appreciated. Councillor Theos. Oh, Mr. Richta,
sorry.
So, were you done? I think we're good, right?
Yeah, you can ask questions.
Yeah, no, I just, I got to put a hand down. I totally forgot to do it earlier. Councillor Theos, back to you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Inspector Kerpers, for the update and for finishing on a positive note. The few points that I was going to bring up of concern and heightened concern based on the numbers, and question after that. But the areas that I mean, many areas have seemed to escalate in their levels from previous years' numbers. So from 2018, 2019, or 2018 to 19, and 2019 to 20, I'm seeing a concern in property crimes that you highlighted. The criminal code offenses have seemed to raise in all the communities by quite a bit, and I don't know why that's happening, but again, it's something that's happening in all the communities from what looks like 15 to 30% in the increases. And the drug offenses also have me concerned because they, other than cannabis, which was now not part of the equation anymore from last year to this year, but it seems like all the other drug offenses are escalating. So I don't know what's causing that. Couple questions though, Inspector. One is in regards to the public disturbances and in custody component. I'm noticing the public disturbances went from 1,345 last year to 2,832 this year. If you could just elaborate what that means and why you think there's a spike there, that would be appreciated.
Let me just find it here.
Okay, that's the public
page
disturbances.
15.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, okay. So
And then the second.
Let's do one question at a time, Councillor Theos.
Okay, thank you so much.
A lot of that is relates to a lot of our clients that are on the street. We deal with a lot of breach files. A lot of our clients that have issues, mental health issues and other addictions are bulk of our calls. So public disturbances, I can name 6 individuals and more that are constantly being reported for running in the middle of the road or screaming obscenities and things like that. So that's your public disturbances. So part of that is that, you know, it happens up on top of Ryan at Crown Owl because they're coming from the hospital or they're going to the hospital and they're just off a little bit and they need their treatment and they don't go to their treatment. So we get a lot of that. We try and manage those by a lot of individuals are on conditions. So we try and breach those people. Unfortunately, with the times, people who have breach charges don't stay in custody. A lot of times we try and if they can't manage their own health, we try and help them with that by trying to get them into the hospital and get them to treatment. We do have the crisis nurse program where if they're in our custody, we can bring them right into our cell block to get treatment and assessed. We do that at the hospital. That's our first goal, is to get them assessed. Unfortunately, there's criminal activity that goes along with this. And for us to kind of deal with that and manage that behavior, we have to breach them. And for Crown Council to actually pay attention to breach, we have to do a lot of them. So that's where that count comes up. So it could take up to a dozen breach calls or files for them to compile that and kind of tackle that problem. I hope that answers your question.
It does, Inspector Curvers. And if I may ask the follow-up, the second question, because it actually did bridge into that, what your comments just were. I had a feeling that your answer was in that direction with mental health, and a lot of these issues are the public disturbances were caused by mental health challenges, and it seems to be taking up a tremendous amount of your resources. And what my question is, the second question is in regards to Victoria and I don't know if they followed through. I haven't actually had an opportunity to see whether they followed through or not, but they were talking about having a ride along with a mental health expert that may know many of these clients, and could be out there and communicating with these members, and basically taking a lot of the that stress off the RCMP, in which maybe don't have expertise in mental health. And I'm just wondering your thoughts on whether we're considering a program like that, or if you've heard about the program in Victoria, if they actually did put it together and how it's working, and whether you think that could work here or not.
I don't know much about the municipal side of it, but I know Surrey has it, but they have 800 members there, so they can put a resource to that. Right now, our best step is the crisis nurse program we have. We have that MOU with the hospital and the staff there. When we take these individuals into custody, we do bring them either to the hospital or to ourselves, and they'll get that firsthand treatment. They'll get treatment front end. The outreach program you're kind of suggesting, that's something, I think Nanaimo was doing it. It's something, it's got to be funded for one, and then we need a dedicated resource from our side. So that'll take one road resource off the front lines to deal with just that component and dealing with that. And then you probably need more than one because they can't work 24/7. So it's scheduling challenges, resource challenges. I think we have the next best step, which is having that crisis nurse program.
Thanks for the insight on that matter, Inspector Curvers. I appreciate it.
And Councillor Morin.
Great, thanks, Mayor. Well, one of the questions was partially answered, and that was around the mental health calls. I wanted to bring it up because, of course, it is in the news right now, and I certainly have not heard of our community concerns with response to mental health calls and similar calls to that. In fact, I do hear about a lot of compassionate response, but I did want to maybe have you provide for the public what exactly does happen. It sounds like you involve the crisis nurse. Sometimes they can come right into the cell. And I just wondered if you have any particular personnel who respond to those calls, or you know, if any of, do you keep any records or stats on any of those kind of escalations that may occur where you may need some kind of force or restraint? I just think it would be helpful for the public to know what our local response is to that type of call. And I do like the idea of, you know, that collaborative approach with mental health, but I do understand that that requires resources as well. So that's my first question, and then I have one after that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, the crisis nurse program is very helpful to us. Our first priority is their health and safety. So our frontline guys and girls typically respond to those calls because it's usually a priority call, and our dispatchers will take information, and then we will send resources to that. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 individuals because we know the history of certain individuals. So that's how we respond. We wait and see what we come up against first. Like, we have to, as police officers, we have to assess scenarios and situations very quickly. A lot of times if they're running down the middle of the street and they're not stopping for us, we do have to go physical, and we have to try and apprehend them to stop that, because it's putting his safety at risk, plus ours, plus the other general community people in the area. So we take everything into consideration. We try and manage and mitigate what we have to, what we're up against. And we don't know until we actually get there and what kind of response we get from the client.
Mm-hmm. And would it make a difference if someone on the, you know, if you do get that information up front, like in the case of a wellness check, or someone is concerned about someone in the public that don't seem to be necessarily a danger to others, but maybe more of a danger to themselves, or maybe even fearful of someone else? Would that create a different kind of response?
No, our response is going to be the same. We take everything into account, and we will do a background check. Typically, the individuals we come across we're familiar with already, so we know pretty well what kind of response we're going to get. Right.
Okay. My second question was around the drug offenses. Of course, you know, we've got some changes during COVID right now where unfortunately, we don't have much of uptake in this community yet for folks to have a safe supply of drugs through a prescription with their doctors. But, you know, hopefully, in my opinion, that will increase. And I guess I'm wondering, in terms of, is the focus more on folks who are dealing, or those kind of higher level individuals in terms of trafficking? Because, you know, personally, I'm hopeful that the actual possession and use of substances will have less of a criminal element and more of a health focus. And it certainly looks like the province is moving in that direction. There's already talk about this to continue past COVID. So I'm just wondering where the focus is in terms of those kind of drug offenses. Are you arresting people for possession or use, or is it more for trafficking, that kind of thing?
Mostly trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
you got to understand that the people that are using, it's the criminal activity that accompanies that we're kind of focusing on, like
Right.
you know, the beanies and the theft from motor vehicles. A lot of times the possession charges are put in the mix, but they're not really spoken to. We have targets and individuals and groups that we look at. That's part of our provincial threat assessment program. We look at individuals. I can say there's no gangs here, which is nice. We don't have to worry about that. We don't have high-level drug dealers. We have some mid-level ones that we try and target, and a lot of that is evidence-based. And as you know, we need the evidence to support charges, so we try and work on that.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. And Councillor Hillian.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks for your presentation, Inspector. I'm gratified to know that the really solid police work that has gone on behind the scenes is resulting in charges related to the love bug shooting and the machete attack that happened last summer. And congratulations to your staff for all the hard work that's involved in that. Earlier on, there was a reference, I think it may have been Councillor Frisch, to the role of Crime Stoppers in the community. And I wonder, since I believe we help to fund Crime Stoppers, if in fact they are active in patrolling areas such as the Pidcock neighborhood, the railway tracks corridor, and whether or not you see them being engaged in helping to address some of the concerns that we've heard about from people who congregate in that area, whether they live at a particular facility or not, since we know that that is a challenging area.
Yeah, Citizen Patrol you're referring to?
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, so I know the folks that were running that are kind of stepping back. We're trying to engage that again. I know Constable Taragny is trying to get that up and running. Block Watch is another program we can use, and they're very successful. It's more of a see and report scenario. We don't want them engaging in anything to get them in a bad situation, so that's our responsibility. But like I said to the individuals from the junction and Kiwanis, the Kiwanis village is very underreported, and they admit themselves they're afraid to report to us. Okay, well, there's a number of ways we can deal with that. If they want to do Crime Stoppers, they can do it anonymously. They can call our line and say anonymous, and then we still take the report. For us to kind of target and identify solutions, we need some solid basic stats to follow through with. So it's challenging from our side when we're not getting the calls, and we can send cars and individuals into the area. They're just going to scatter. And once we leave, they just come back, and we need a better solution to that.
Thanks. And the other question I had was to what extent the bike patrols are going to continue to be active in the community?
They're a full-time unit. They are summer and winter. You're going to see them.
Great. Thanks very much.
Excellent. And so there was 3 PowerPoints, as far as I can tell, for the presentation. So one was the one that we spoke about earlier, the Kiwanis Village and the Junction, the 2-pager. In the agenda, there was the colored one that was a little bit longer, and then there was the third one. And so I'm almost wondering if all 3 should be included in the agenda, just because they were all spoken to, and I'll look to Ms. Church if that makes sense to include them or not. But potentially we can include them as a link on the website, even if people want to have access to them, just so that they can look to it if they're watching the video and get the information. So
yeah, I have no objection.
Okay. Okay, with that, I believe we, unless there's any further questions, again, I just want to thank Inspector Curvers. I think that lots of really good stuff is happening, and even last week reaching out to just notify the local leaders to say you were aware of the protests that were going to be happening, but that you felt that everything was in hand. Just I think that really helps reassure everybody, and really do want to thank you for that. Again, being a presentation, I'm going to assume it's a unanimous receipt unless somebody waves their hand furiously to say they didn't like something that Inspector Kerber said, but I don't see that. So we're going to consider that a unanimous receipt. And Inspector Kerbers, you are free to go.
Just one final point.
You bet.
Just before I came into the meeting, there was another protest just starting up at Sims Park.
Okay.
It's just a small one. The other two are very peaceful and very organized, and we're okay with that.
Excellent. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks again for the heads up. I appreciate that.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks again. All right. Next, we have the summer meeting schedule.
Yeah, Mayor, I'll move that based on today's staff report entitled Summer Meeting Schedule 2020, that Council approve option 1 and cancel the following scheduled meetings: July 27th, the 2020 Committee of the Whole, and August 31st, the other 2020 Committee of the Whole meeting. And that the March, this is a long one, so I'll just keep going. And that the March 30th, 2020 resolution to modify the council meeting schedule in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic be rescinded, with the exception of the recommendation made by the provincial and federal health authorities to maintain physical distancing and restrict public gatherings as a prevention measure related to the spread of the COVID-19, and as administered by extraordinary powers declared under the provincial state of emergency through the Emergency Act, and so on and so forth, which states a special meeting may be conducted by means of electronic or other communications, and that council meetings be posted and be made available to the public via live web streaming on the City of Courtenay's website, and that in recognition of limited staff capacity and available internal and external resources during the COVID-19 pandemic, that council meeting agendas be adjusted but not limited to priority, statutory, essential, or critical functions and services, and that a regular council meeting be scheduled on June 29th in place of the June 29th Committee of the Whole meeting.
And I'll second that. Thanks, David.
Oh, thanks you for your part.
That was the expurgated version. It was a much longer motion originally. Now, are there any questions or comments, or does staff want to speak to it? Councillor McCullough?
Sorry, am I unmuted? Okay. I just wanted to ask about whether or not we're going to have a separate process for discussing getting back to in-person meetings, or if the intention of the report is that we continue on in this format until we revisit it later in the summer.
Mr. Allen?
Yeah, this is a separate conversation with council. This is just about the summer meeting schedule and getting back to the regular times and schedule leading up to that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I think one of the challenges that we have when we look at our council chambers and the size of it is getting council members in there may be okay, but as soon as we start adding staff, and if you look at the Zoom screen here in gallery mode, you know, we have up to 20, 25 people participating. So that can be a bit of a challenge in that space. Yeah, I think that conversation is going to continue. Councillor Frisch?
Thanks, Mayor. I just wanted to clarify the live web streaming. So I understand that that's through YouTube, but is it in fact through our website as well? Is that correct?
Mr. Allen?
I'd have to refer this either back to John Ward or to Wendy Surgta.
Through the CEO to Mayor and Council, there's a link on our website for it. It is through YouTube, but there's a link, and then they're stored on our website for future reference as well.
Well, that's excellent. I have been hearing that it's much more interesting to watch our meetings when they're actually live. I don't think more than, I think I saw 15 people maybe today, so it's not huge numbers, but it is nice if people do enjoy seeing it live, that they're able to, and if we're able to do that, I do appreciate that, so thank you.
Excellent. And I believe there'll be discussions, in terms of public hearings and those kinds of things, how when and if and all those kinds of things as well. So excellent. I will poll council on this one, just that we are voting on it. I've lost my list. Here we go. Polling council, starting with Councillor Cole Hamilton. I always know who I'm going to start with, but for some reason I get lost after that.
In favor. Thank you, Mayor.
Councillor Frisch.
In favor, thanks.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
Sorry, in favor.
Excellent. Councillor Morin.
In favor.
And Councillor Theos.
I'm in favor.
And I'm in favor as well, so that's unanimous. Thanks very much. And moving right along, we do have the housing needs assessment.
I think I was supposed to move receipt for that. I'll move
I'll
receipt.
second it.
Okay. And with that, we'll pass it over to staff. And I know we have probably lots of information. Mr. Allen.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. So yes, really no need for formal introductions. I guess it's laid out well in the agenda, but I think we'll turn it over first to Elena Molali, who's the Senior Manager of Sustainability and RGS Planning with the CVRD. So I'll pass it on to her.
Great, thanks very much, David. Hi, everyone. Through the mayor to council and staff, thank you very much for having us here tonight. I'm here with our consultants, Sarah Ravlich and Neil Levitt, to present you with Courtenay's Housing Needs Assessment, the final report. As you know, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment was undertaken as a joint initiative under our Regional Growth Strategy Service, and assessments have been prepared for each member municipality and the electoral areas. Today, you will be hearing the City of Courtenay's specific findings of that assessment, as well as some references to the broader regional findings. The project was funded through a grant from the Union of BC Municipalities, and completion of this work will meet our provincial requirement. You'll recall that legislation was recently introduced. Before I turn it over to Neil and Sarah for the presentation, I would like to thank you, Council, very much for agreeing to undertake this project together. This regional effort gives us a much richer picture of our community's needs and positions us well to take regional action and to advocate as a region to tackle some of our region's most challenging issues. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah Ravlich.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for having us this evening. I'm just going to do a share screen here and see if I can get our PowerPoint up for you. Okay. And there we go. I think you should be able to see that now. Does that look good? Can I get a thumbs up from somebody that were, yep, great, thanks, Elena. Okay, so Neil and I are going to try and be fairly expedient and stick to kind of our 20 minutes, I think, that we have allotted today. As Elena said, we're going to go over some Courtenay specific findings and then also speak to some of the findings for our regional report as well. So just quickly, I'm Sarah Ravlich. I'm a community planner with Gather Planning and Engagement, and we are located in the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking people, now known as the Beecher Bay, Songhees, and Esquimalt First Nation. So I'm down in Victoria. And Neil, do you want to introduce yourself before we jump in?
Sure, yeah, I'm Neil Levitt, I guess Vice President of Planning Economic Intelligence at Turner Drake and Partners. So our role on the project was largely related to the data, and that's what I'll be speaking to in the presentation. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Neil. Okay, and as Elena also mentioned briefly, the housing needs assessments are in response to new legislation that was introduced in 2019 by the provincial government, mandating all local governments to complete a housing needs assessment within the next 3 years, and then be updating those housing needs assessments on a 5-year cycle. So they are fairly prescriptive with what they'd like to see in there. There's about 50 points of data that are collected in order to make up the housing needs assessment, and then a much shorter list of things that need to be reported out on in order to meet those legislated requirements. So everything that's presented to you today does satisfy those requirements for Courtenay, as well as all of the other local governments within the CBRD through the regional report. So what's in this report? Really, this is speaking to what's happening locally in the community and in the region. So there's a lot of information provided around demographics, households, income, economy, housing affordability. And then also kind of looking at who is this happening to. So some specific affordability analysis that's been done, community engagement data, and some identification of which groups within the community may be struggling and those who are struggling potentially the most. We want to be very clear that what's not in these reports is any direction around where new housing should go or what forms density should look like or take within your communities. That's really up to each local government now to move these conversations forward and decide how that is reflected throughout your kind of policy tools that you have. So just quickly, our timeline here. So we actually started in October of 2019 and through kind of the late fall and into the new year, really focused on that data collection and community engagement pieces. We did do a series of council presentations in March, and I believe we were supposed to make it around to Courtenay Council at that time, but then of course we all know that things kind of got changed. So we're here now today and able to present the final document, which is great. So I'll hand it over to Neil. He's going to talk a little bit about the key findings and some of the data pieces.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. So just to pull out a few notable things for Courtenay in particular, the city had the highest proportion of single-person households. So this isn't really surprising from our perspective. Larger communities tend to have the more larger pool of rental stock, so they tend to be more suitable for households of that size. So as a result, it had the smaller average household size of the region. Because it is the service center of the region, it also experiences the highest rates of visible homelessness. And so a lot of the support services, the actual assisted supportive housing facilities are located there. So that's where the people requiring those services tend to concentrate. Senior, not seasonal, persons in terms of a demographic segment are growing much faster than the overall rate of growth. So just like many places in Canada, you have an aging population dynamic. When it comes to income, median household income cannot reasonably afford a median single family or townhouse price. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but basically again, a lot of communities in the region across the country, housing affordability challenges have been increasing significantly in recent years to the point now that the sort of gold standard that people strive for, home ownership of a detached house, is increasingly out of reach for sort of the average household. Almost 50% of renters are living in accommodations that are not reasonably affordable. Again, a bit more detail of that to come, but where housing affordability challenges have been increasing, they've been increasing and most severely felt in households that occupy rental tenured housing. And we also have some data on short-term rentals, Airbnbs, HomeAway, those types of platforms. So we have some numbers about how that's evolved over the last 4 years, and we can put that in a bit of context with the rental housing stock. Next slide there, Sarah.
Okay.
So just to start off with some high level sort of base demographic information, over the last 10 years, Courtenay has experienced fairly steady growth, about 1.5% a year, 14.3% over the last 10. That's projected to continue, albeit at a slightly lower pace, 1.1% annually. But really the big story demographically is that aging population dynamic. So even though your overall population base is projected to increase at a fairly typical level for a mature Canadian municipality, this proportion of your population that will be aged over 65 is increasing at 4 times that rate. So really, as part of this report, we projected growth for the next 5 years. Virtually all of that growth can be accounted for by your population age 65 or over. So you're going to have, another 3,000 or so folks in that age group that are really going to change the balance of that population and the housing needs that they have. Next slide, please. In terms of the housing stock in Courtenay, as of the 2016 census, there were just shy of 12,000 households, and just shy of a third of them were in rental occupied housing. We expect, again, as that aging demographic continues to play out, likely the proportion of rental households will increase, as well as that average household size, which is already the lowest in the region, will continue to decrease. And just again, high level income statistics, owner occupied households had a median household income of just shy of $70,000 a year. And renter occupying households for the same year had about half of that, 34,000 and change. So those income measures are, that pattern of higher owner to renters is not atypical. And you'll really see how that impacts the housing need in the next couple slides here. So again, just, hopefully you've had time to look through the report. It's 100 and something pages of a lot of charts, and we only have 20 minutes. So if I had to pick sort of one stat to highlight the conditions as far as housing needs goes in the city of Courtenay, it would be the core housing need metric. And this is developed by Statistics Canada as well as CMHC. And they look at housing need across 3 dimensions. Affordability, which is the main one, and essentially they're looking at households, the percentage that are spending more than 30% of their pre-tax income on housing expenses. And also to the degree that they don't have an alternative. So it's not that they're choosing to spend more because they want a certain location or a certain housing type. It's that they don't have any other suitable alternative at a more affordable price range. The other 2 dimensions are suitability, which I just mentioned, which relates to the size of the housing unit relative to the family size, so essentially the number of bedrooms, and then the adequacy, which refers to the physical state of repair of the household. So those last 2, suitability and adequacy, are usually the much lower drivers of housing need. It's largely related to affordability. And this chart does a really great job of showing the differential impact of affordability between tenure types. So you have the overall rate of core housing need at 13.9% for the municipality, but among owner-occupied households, that's only actually 5%, whereas renter-occupied households experience a much higher rate, 7 times higher at just over 35%. Next slide, please. There's also a measure of extreme core housing need, which is essentially the same thing, except it bumps that affordability threshold from 30% of before tax household income up to 50%. And so you will typically see a reduction in the percentages across the board, but again, we see a typical pattern of not only renters being disproportionately represented here, but also the adjustment from core housing need to extreme core housing need is much more forgiving on owners than renters. There's still a very large proportion of renter occupying households that experience significant housing affordability challenges. Almost 1 in 5 of your rental households spending in excess of half of their household income on their shelter costs. And so the last slide on housing affordability metrics, and I don't want to spend too much time because there's a lot going on with this, but in the report, we conducted a gap analysis to compare median income of different household types, economic families as defined by Statistics Canada in this case, looking at their median income. And then we compared that against either average rental statistics or using sort of typical mortgage assumptions, what the cost of housing for owner occupied would be across different types of units. And so the chart shows it's color-coded green or red, depending on whether that family type could afford that housing type at a affordable threshold for their median income. And the numbers themselves quantify either how far below the affordability threshold they're falling, or how much in excess they are. So really the main points here are that non-economic families, which really refers to individuals or maybe someone living with a roommate, are extremely hard pressed to find housing of any type that is affordable for them. They're having to overreach that affordability threshold. And really the only family types that are able to afford single family owner occupied housing are couples with kids. So couples without children are not doing too bad. They can afford a lot of owner occupied options. But the only one that is kind of green across the board is the couples with children house family type. I think it's back to you there, Sarah.
Yep, great. Thanks, Neil. So something kind of that is prominent through the data, and also I think through the engagement that we've heard, is first there is a demonstrated need for housing across all of the unit types. But in particular, looking at this kind of missing middle and how that is kind of a need for particularly working families and others in the community. So that's kind of referring to that need for below market rental up to kind of affordable, attainable home ownership that is currently out of reach for a lot of folks in Courtenay and in the Valley as a whole. This will become even more important kind of with supportive housing options and additional tenure models, as Neil mentions, as the population ages at such a rapid rate. And then also we'll speak to, on a slider here, here as well, is a need for more of those deep affordable rentals. So rentals that are available and affordable for folks who are receiving rental assistance or rental subsidies. There is a real lack of those options available at the affordability rates that are needed. So a lot of the data in the report you'll see it relies heavily on StatsCan data. And I will say, if you are an individual who is unhoused or precariously housed, you're not always well represented through that StatsCan data. So we've looked at other things, BC Housing's waitlist, some information available through the PIT count to try and get an understanding of what that kind of extreme housing need might look like. So there is certainly a need for non-market housing options in the region. The vast majority of what is currently available is located in Courtenay. When we pulled these numbers in January of this year, there were currently 270 households that were on BC Housing's wait list to receive supports within the region. So those supports look like all kinds of things, from a housing unit itself up to receiving a rent subsidy in order to afford rent within the private market. We also know in 2018, when the PIT count was done, there are 117 individuals who are identified as unhoused. There was another PIT count done in March of this year, and hopefully those numbers should be available soon, so we can kind of see how that need is changing over time. I will say it is important to note that PIT counts are generally understood to be an underrepresentation of what that actual need is. And we did hear through community engagement that there appears to be a lot of hidden homelessness taking place in the Valley, whether that's through folks who are couch surfing, living in RVs, boats, living in vehicles. So likely we could expect that those numbers are higher than what is reported through the PIT count. Speaking a little bit to our engagement and trying to kind of quantify what the needs of those who are unhoused might look like, we did host a lived experience focus group in the community. So speaking with folks who are currently unhoused or precariously housed. And just a few things that kind of came to light through that. Most of the folks that we spoke to were older, over the age of 50, and most had lived in the region for quite some time, 10 years or more in most cases. And they kind of reiterated, I think, a lot of what we're hearing through the data, so that it's very hard if you're a single person to find affordable and safe housing options in the region, and that there's a need for more affordable rental options. There was a feeling that rental options or single occupancy rooms were once more available in the region, but those have been lost maybe to redevelopment in the downtown cores. It was really kind of reiterated that not everyone has complex health or addiction issues and don't necessarily feel safe living in those kind of more supportive housing options and really are just looking for affordable options for themselves. Many instances of folks living in poor conditions of housing due to the cost. And then everyone was very much supportive and thankful for the support staff that are available to them within the region to provide services.
And just to jump back in and kind of on that note around support for social housing, this was a chart that we put together after some feedback from stakeholders trying to illustrate one facet of the challenge that's been going on over the last 10 years, which is the cost of housing changing relative to the level of support that's available. So this is essentially an index, if you're familiar, shows the change in a price level of something over time. So we're here showing the level of income assistance or rental assistance for low-income households from the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. So the amount of rental assistance that's offered hasn't changed in a long time. That's the green line. If we chart that as it stood in 2010, just due to inflation over that time period, the purchasing power of that support has eroded by about 10% up till 2019. So it goes from 100% down to 90% essentially on the y-axis there. Meanwhile, the cost of rental housing has increased significantly. So bachelors it's a bit of a complicated one because it shows nominally a price decline more recently, but a lot of that is due to change in the availability of bachelor units. So those have actually decreased in terms of the number of units that are there. Likely, it just means that the lower priced ones are all that's left and there's not many of them. One bedrooms are more common. They do a better job of showing the overall price level in the rental market. And so you can see how over time, especially after 2017, the cost of rent for even a small unit has increased by now up to, in excess of 10, getting up to maybe 12% over its 2010 levels. And so just through those change in trends over time, the actual power of the support that's offered through social assistance for rent has created a gap of about 20%. So that just kind of highlights how trends have changed and the social supports and the options available to people haven't kept pace. And I think I have one more slide. Yeah, and so just a quick note on the short-term rental markets. Again, mentioned Airbnb, sort of the typical one people associate. We purchased some third-party data. One of the challenges with short-term rentals is it's a private company, and so it's not a very transparent market. But we did the best we could to get third-party data based on scraping of these web portals to kind of quantify what the size of this market is. And so we have in the blue lines, short-term rental listings that are associated with a whole unit. So it's not just, and this is the overall market, it's not just a bedroom or a basement apartment or something like that that you rent out when you're not home. It's its own contained unit that could be potentially rental market housing. And then the difference between the blue and the green refers to just the portion that is likely operated as a commercial business. So we looked at how often through the year a unit was available on the market. And if they were available for more than half the year, we assumed that, okay, well, that's likely a commercial operation because it's not available or it's available on the market for the majority of its existence through the year. So it's unlikely to be something else as a primary use. And then the difference between the solid and the dashed lines are whether it's that entire unit or if it is that sort of shared room or bedroom in a shared dwelling or something like that. And so really what we're concerned about when we're talking about impacts to the housing market is the solid green line, which is entire unit commercially operated short-term rental listings. and they represent the vast majority of the total pool of listings. This is common across the country, and they've also experienced quite significant growth over the last 4 years. However, the level we're sitting at now, about, if I'm just eyeballing the chart, maybe 58 units or so as of the peak last July. That's about 1.5% of your rental housing stock. So it is a growing and difficult to track trend, but as it stands now, it is still a minor contributor to your challenges. So you could fix affordable housing issues without addressing short-term rentals, but you couldn't address short-term rentals entirely and therefore fix the affordable housing challenge.
Okay, just in the last couple of minutes here, I'm going to speak to some of the kind of key themes that came through some of our community engagement activities. We heard that regional employers are finding it very difficult to attract and retain staff. This is kind of equated generally to a lack of rental availability in the region. And as a region as a whole, there's a high percentage of workforce who's employed in the sales and service sector. And traditionally, those sectors don't have high enough incomes to purchase a home. So it's a real lack of rental options that would be affecting employers' ability to operate and obtain and retain employees. Young families and single parents are struggling to meet their needs, and we certainly see that for single parents through the affordability analysis. We see that nonprofits and social service organizations are routinely bearing the cost of serving the most vulnerable in the region, and that burden is increasing over time without budgets necessarily increasing accordingly to meet those needs. There is a great need for smaller housing units. So we've kind of spoke to that a couple of times around that growing percentage of one-person households that we are seeing. Community members really do, in the current market, need additional supports in order to afford the increased housing costs that they're seeing. Through our community survey that we did, we had almost 900 respondents to that. And 25% of those individuals who completed a survey indicated that they accessed housing supports in the last 2 months. And that may not be financial support, but that may also speak to reaching out to the food bank and those other kinds of things to help with overall living costs. Very low vacancy rate in the region and the city create instability for renters in the private market is really not meeting those needs. We heard a lot about kind of red evictions and just that general housing insecurity of having to bounce from house to house to house and maybe not having that option or an affordable option available to you every time that you need to again enter the rental market and find something. We heard that the increase in rental costs are really impacting overall quality of life. And we can kind of we've seen that through the affordability measures and through kind of the data that was gathered through the survey as well, that 58% of people indicated that their monthly housing costs were not affordable to them, and thus they're having to kind of make trade-offs in other areas of their lives as well. As we said, there's a need for non-market housing options, both with and without supports, and we clearly heard that through engagement as well. And then another piece that came out quite strongly is how strongly linked transportation, the need for affordable, reliable transportation and housing costs are in the region, both for young people who don't drive, can't afford a vehicle, and for older folks who may no longer be able to drive, but may be living rurally and don't have access to transportation. And then kind of a key piece that came out of this survey that really stood out for us is 25% of folks that responded to that community survey indicated that they're considering moving out of their community due to housing issues that they are facing. So just very quickly to wrap up, as we said, this report contains the what and the who. It doesn't determine the how, and there's many different ways to address that. We certainly heard through our work that there's a broad consensus and willingness to act across the region, which is very hopeful. And then, of course, this report's not an answer, but it certainly, we hope it serves to be a tool to help inform your next steps and your discussions moving forward.
Excellent. And just give me 1 second. This is full screen. I just got to get the, there we go. Participants list, and Councillor Frisch, you're first up.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and thanks, Sarah and Neil. That was a great presentation. I was wondering if you might just, well, the two questions I have. One was about the household size, and you were saying how the city being a bit larger would naturally have smaller household size. Can you just maybe expand on that a bit? Does that mean that single people and people without children might rather live in a larger center? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, it can be a number of things. Part of it is it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation where, especially when it comes to rental housing availability, if you are a smaller household, an individual, or maybe roommates or someone downsizing, that type of housing is generally only mostly available in larger centers. So Courtenay would naturally have a larger stock of housing that would be appropriate for smaller households. It can also relate to the availability of educational facilities, services that are required by people of certain demographics or life stages. But really, I think it's largely related to the availability of housing and the draw of larger urban centers for the types of households that are more dependent on sort of certain services or urban kind of convenient living situation.
Okay, that makes sense. And so, yet, ironically, we're still looking at a forecast showing that we need more 2 and 3 bedroom units. So how does that play into it?
The forecasts are required just to speak to the bedroom count, but not necessarily the type of housing unit. So, a perfect example is if you have an aging demographic trend and you have maybe older baby boomers that are looking to downsize, they might be in a larger 3-bedroom house. Maybe they don't want a lawn to mow anymore. They might look for an apartment, but they still want to have the grandkids over. They still maybe want to have a home office or some extra storage. So they, even though it's two people or possibly even one person household, might still look for a 2-bedroom unit, but in a different housing style than what they're used to.
Okay. And finally, if I might ask a third, it was around the idea of secure tenure. And I'll preface it with asking if obviously you looked at our units being built right now that obviously aren't up yet, but should be up in the next year or two. Did you consider those?
Yeah, we would have looked at those as part of our projection of future housing demand. I can't speak to those figures just off the top of my head, unfortunately.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess what I'm wondering is, looking forward, in my mind, secure tenure means a type of housing where, you won't be kicked out if the owner decides to move in or wants to renovate necessarily. So that would be more purpose-built rentals, cooperative housing. So I imagine supportive housing and what's the other one? Government funded housing and community housing would be included in that. So do we know anything about where those numbers are at or where they will be in the future?
I'm not sure about sort of the non-market housing figures. I think just off the bat, I would agree as far as your characterization of secure housing. It really relates to, or security of tenure rather, relates to the size of a sort of formal rental housing sector, so purpose-built rentals, or at the very least, a rental market that has a sufficient vacancy, that there isn't quite the same pattern or pressure on unscrupulous landlords to kick people out and sort of, upmarket their units, those types of things. So a less of a tight rental market can also improve tenure security. In terms of sort of market rate housing, certainly one thing we saw in the building permit data, as well as talking to stakeholders and staff in Courtenay, is that there is quite a large amount of purpose-built rental projects in the pipeline. I'm not sure, the numbers off the top of my head of where they are in the sort of stages of development or approval, but there is a recent trend to build more of it, which is encouraging. It's unlikely that that's sufficient. So it's, you're on a good track there, but I would encourage you to try to, encourage that trend even further.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Can I just add one piece to that, Neil? And we did try to kind of reiterate this through the report. And I think if you look at the regional report, it is there. But I will say with the projections and what's being shared, those really will just allow you to maintain status quo. So if you were to meet those projections, your affordability levels would remain the same. They're not projecting how many units you would need to kind of move out of the level of affordability that is currently needed. So this is kind of minimum what would need to be done to meet need over time as your population grows. But it's not pointing to, how much further you could go in order to address those affordability needs.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Sarah. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah, and I think it'd be something where staff could probably come back to us in the future and talk about all the stuff that's already in the pipeline. And actually, maybe I'll pass it over to Mr. Buck right now, since he waved his hand.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mayor. Just very quickly, I was looking at those stats before the meeting. And as a comparison, 2019 year to date, we'd issued last year 124 single family permits and 240 multifamily permits. So roughly a 2-to-1 multifamily to single family. Year to date, currently we're at 27 single family units and 117 multis issued. So we're at about a 4-to-1, and applications that permits haven't been issued for, we're about 200 multifamily units that we have applications in the door. Majority of those are purpose-built rentals, and a few of them are under the BC Housing Hub program, which there was an announcement, can't remember if it was late last year, earlier this year, about the rents are still quite high in that program, geared towards more middle income earners, but they are purpose-built rentals in the queue.
Thanks very much, Mr. Buck. And Councillor McCollum.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you both to Sarah and Neil for the presentation. It was very interesting, and it's really great to see this report coming forward. We've been thinking on it and hearing about it for the last year, so it's great to see some of this tabulated for us. I'll just make a comment about one thing that stood out for me is that in reading the report summary for Courtenay specifically, I noticed in the in table 23.2, it's basically a graph showing what types of housing increased in, or what the increases were for the different types of housing. And the 2- and 3-bedroom units seem to be the most impacted in terms of increases in like the last year or so. And the other thing that stood out, sorry, I think I had that backwards, and then there's basically another graph showing what we're building, and we've seen a real improvement in getting more apartment style housing built, but there hasn't been a big change in semi-detached, which I think is a really important piece for addressing family housing. These 2- and 3-bedroom units is really townhouses. It's generally what families would prefer to be in if they have the option. So it definitely kind of highlights for me that we need to look for ways to encourage that type of development. And then I had a question. It's around our projections. I realize that all the data that's available in terms of demographic is coming back from the 2016 census. And, that's now 4 years away. And it was pointed out in the presentation that we're using a projection of 1.1% growth. I assume that when we say projection, that would be projecting from 2016. So are we projecting like 9 years worth of growth at 1.1%? And then I guess the question is, to follow up, if that projection is off by say 0.5%, like what would be the impact to the anticipated demand numbers toward the end of the report for Courtenay? Would that change things drastically, or would that be a difference of, you know, a few dozen units? What does that look like?
Sure, yeah. So I guess just first on the method for doing the population projection. So yeah, we're using not just the 2016 census, but actually the previous 2 census periods as well. And so on an age-specific basis, kind of looking at what are the trends in migration as well as births and deaths, and using that to project forward 5 years in this case, so to 2025. And so that works out to an average of 1.1%, but the model doesn't use a percentage to create a number. It creates the number, and then we kind of derive the percentage from that, I guess. So it does take into account things like aging demographics leading to a higher, smaller households means a higher number of households relative to the change in the number of people. So some of those sort of population level changes. What these types of models don't do a good job of is anticipating significant changes in migration patterns. And especially when we're talking about a geographic scale the size of the city of Courtenay, or a community the size of the city of Courtenay in terms of number of people. One thing we saw in the data, and I can kind of speculate at from some other data points, is that the rate of growth and the impact of the housing market in Courtenay from 2017 to 2019, to me, is evident to being impacted by provincial housing market conditions, especially in Vancouver and Victoria. And so if you have a situation where price pressure in another community suddenly creates a migration pattern that hasn't existed historically, you might find that, if that continues, for example, we'd actually see more than a 1.1% annual change in increase in growth. It might be, 1.5 or 2 or something like that. So it's really, the projections are meant to be a guidepost, right? Because it's a mathematical model, it spits out these very precise numbers. So it can give a sort of sense of accuracy that is really beyond what is actually going on with the equations. And so I always caution to take the projections with a grain of salt, especially when we're talking about the housing need that projection entails, and I guess the specificity or the decision of whether or not you've achieved your goal by measuring yourself against those projections. To your second question, in terms of what are the implications if those projections are wrong, and I've just told you, of course, they're wrong. We just don't know how wrong they are. I don't think, if we're talking about a 1.1% chance or percent growth rate, and that ends up being a 0.5% growth or a 1.5% growth, that would be a material change in what the projections call for, but the projections themselves don't call for a whole lot, right? Because we're projecting fairly modest growth, a fairly modest amount of housing construction required to accommodate that growth. So as Sarah pointed out, that those growth targets and the housing need that's related to just that growth is only a part of the issue. So in terms of being careful with measuring yourself and your housing goals against those projections, you should also be careful in terms of allowing margin of error. So there's no harm in providing more housing. There's significantly more harm in providing less housing than you think you need. But if you provide more than that, that's just a bonus.
Great. Yeah, that was a great answer to my question. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, and Councillor Hillian.
Thank you, Mayor. And thanks to Neil and Sarah and your team for what to me looks like an excellent report. I must confess it was a bit of a struggle to read through it all, but it seems there's a ton of useful data there that our staff and other communities in the Valley will be able to make use of, not just in relation to housing. It seems to me there's a lot of relevant information there that will help inform the poverty reduction strategy that the regional district has just received a significant grant to work on. But overall, I wanted to thank you for reflecting what you heard from people. I think you did an excellent job at engaging a lot of people. And it seems to me that your report reflects what people actually told you. And I really appreciate that, seeing some of my own comments reflected in there. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Councillor.
And Councillor Morin.
Sorry about that. My screen is minimized and I can't seem to figure out how to get it back. Anyway, yes, thank you so much. Excellent detailed report with, as others have mentioned, lots of great information. I was pleased to see that you drew out the data around the single folks who are having a hard time with housing, because I'm certainly hearing that anecdotally all the time, and that, you know, we are having some housing created for families. You know, Habitat for Humanity, of course, is catering to families as we need those family homes as well. But those single low-income folks are really struggling, and again, also maybe not feeling like they fit in certain types of housing. So just kind of illustrating the need for a variety. So that was great to know and have highlighted. The other comment or question I wanted to make was, you know, these assessments, of course, are going on all through the province, and I'm just wondering if there's any kind of a phase 2 in terms of going from collecting the who and what to going forward to the how, and also if there's any kind of organized system in place for communities across the province to work together, comparable needs and maybe demographics, etc., looking at kind of solutions together. And I'm just wondering if there's anything planned going forward in that regard.
Yeah, I can speak to a couple of those points. So unfortunately, as far as funding or direction from the province to move forward with kind of a housing strategy, right now, no, there is no indication of that being available. And no formalized network that I'm aware of either of kind of sharing between communities, though I do know informally, I have heard of a lot of you know, local planners from different places reaching out to others. I know quite a few of the regions around you on the island are also going through this process right now. So there may be an opportunity for staff to kind of work collaboratively and discuss what they're seeing there. But yeah, at this point, next steps are really localized and informal in that way.
And I'm assuming that all the data from all the different communities will be public warehouse somewhere?
Yeah, so as far as meeting the legislative requirements, so the forms that you will have received with the data, that gets submitted to the province, and what they'll do with those, we're not entirely sure. And then all local governments are also required to publish their report online. So you should be able to kind of see, as these are rolling out across the province, everyone's are available publicly in that way.
Great, thank you.
Excellent. And Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you so much. I mean, I to some degree echo Councillor Hillian. There were a lot of numbers to read, but it was a fascinating picture. And there was, we talked a little bit earlier about rental housing, and I just wanted to, one of the most encouraging sort of graphs that I saw in the report was in the longer report. It was figure 23.1, which was the completions of units by intended tenure, whether to be owned or rented. And it seemed that rental houses, the rental units, there were 6 in 2016, 16 in 2017, 12 last year, and then 130 in 2019. So quite an increase from 12 to 130. If we continue along this trajectory of encouraging more rental housing and seeing those kind of levels, is that going to make appears to me a pretty significant increase? Is that going to make a measurable impact on the rental demand?
Yeah, I mean, I think you build more supply, you're going to have increasing demand for it, so you're going to need it. But if you can outpace that demand, that change in demand over time, that will impact prices, and they will mitigate, they will come down. It's important, though, to note that that activity is only really impactful in the market rate housing sector. So a big part of the data and the engagement was on challenges faced by households that are either at the sort of very bottom end of the current housing market in terms of the options that are available, or really require a non-market solution. You know, it's a combination of inflation of housing costs over time, stagnant or decreasing wages in lower, you know, what we would call unskilled labor type occupations. Really, you know, in a nutshell, widening income inequality and stagnation below a certain level of the socioeconomic ladder, if you will. And so that portion of the population is not going to be directly served by simply increasing the proportion of purpose-built rental. That's an important piece of the puzzle, but it's not the full puzzle.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that. And is there a correlation, like if there's more rental housing being built in total, although most of it is aimed towards market rates, does that have some impact upon people who are needing, just simply by increasing the supply and hopefully reducing rental prices? Does that have any measurable impact on those who are housing stressed?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a bit of a counterintuitive fact, right? You quite often, if you are a regular at development application hearings and things like that, hear criticism from the public that, you know, who is this housing for? It's just high-end luxury rentals. You know, who can afford to live there? And there's interconnectedness throughout the housing market. So even though a housing unit may come online at a certain price point, there's you know, everyone talks about the property ladder, right? Everyone down the rungs of that ladder, if they're not competing with someone that's living in that unit, it just frees up the supply that's available at their rungs. And it's a fairly well studied and well documented phenomenon, what's called filtering, where new housing, which is generally constructed at the top end of the market rate, relieves the pressure on housing options further down the, you know, filtered down the pyramid, I guess you'd say. So it's important that, you know, one of the mechanisms by which things like naturally occurring affordable rental housing is removed from the market is because there's not enough there's too much pressure in the demand for housing that it becomes viable to renovict people out of affordable units, slap on some paint, maybe do a quick and dirty renovation, and all of a sudden put that market back, or that unit back on the market at an expensive price. If you have a lot more competition at the higher end of the market, those types of activities become less viable, and those more affordable units will tend to stay more affordable. So it is important for everyone through the housing market to make sure you're keeping up with demand, even if it's at a high price point.
Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying the relationship there. That was very helpful. And thank you for the report in general. Appreciate it.
Excellent. I don't see any further questions or comments. So yeah, I just want to thank you guys for the report today. I think that really gave us a good sense of where things are, and we've had a pretty fulsome discussion. And was there more that needed to be added, Alana? And you've been very quiet. I'm used to hearing you talk when I was at the regional district far more. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Thank you, Mayor Wells. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I was itching a little bit, but I guess the only thing I would like to note is to pick up on Councillor Hillian's comment about the press release from the province that we saw last week, announcing our success in obtaining a grant to prepare a regional poverty reduction strategy. And it is really exciting news. And to Councillor Moran's point, that this will provide us with a local sort of phase 2 opportunity. This is in our application. This is one of the things that we pitched, was we would be coming in with our housing needs assessments and wanted to be able to implement some of our findings. So that is the thing I was itching to say. Thank you.
No, fair enough. Councillor Hillian, were you waving or just giving a thumbs up? Excellent. Yeah, I think again, our council is in great support of this. It's always great to have data-driven decisions as you're making your choices as a council or even as a developer. And I think, as Mr. Buck said, we can look at where construction is going here in the valley, and in particular in Courtenay. Yeah, it certainly is good to see a lot of these more affordable rental kind of places coming online. So I think with that, again, there's no decision to be made. We're just receiving information. So I'll just look to council as another unanimous decision to receive, unless anybody waves their hand in opposition. And thanks again for your presentation today. Thanks for the data. It does really remind me of the reports that we get every couple of years from the Community Foundation, and I've lost the name of the report they give, but very similar to that, where really telling us where things are. So really appreciate that. Thanks very much. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
You guys can go if you want now, and we'll continue on with our meeting. So next, we do have the reports and updates from council. I don't know if any councillors have anything of importance they would like to speak on. I know I did speak of the protest that happened Friday, but I'll look to see if anybody has anything to add. And I don't see anybody jumping up. So with that, we'll move on to the in-camera motion.
I move that a special in-camera motion close to the public will be held June 8th, 2020, at the conclusion of the regular council meeting pursuant to the following subsections of the community charter. 90-1-E, the acquisition, disposition, or expropriation of land or improvements, if the council considers the disclosure could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality. 90-1-I, the receipt of advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose. 90-1-K, negotiations and related discussions respecting the proposed provisions of a municipal service that are their preliminary stages, and that in the view of the council could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality if they were held in public.
Second.
Excellent. And I'll just poll council to make sure you are in favor, starting with Councillor Cole Hamilton.
In favor.
Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Moran.
In favor.
Councillor Theos.
In favor.
And I'm in favor as well, so that's unanimous. Thanks very much. Sorry for giving you so much to read there, Councillor Theos, but all right.
I was reading off my phone, it was so small.
Excellent. And under new business, Councillor Hamilton.
Mayor, I'd like to move receipt of the letter, and can I also, I guess then
I'll
there's
second
a
that.
requested action.
Sure.
Can we assume receipt at this point? And then shall I move the requested action?
Well, we'd have to vote on it, but let's let Mr. Allen speak, and staff may have some other comments. So over to you, Mr. Allen.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So, council, of course, has an option to request a support or a report from staff. I believe that the request is for a $490, relief of a parcel tax or frontage tax, essentially. I just think it's probably wise before council decides to ask for a staff report that I present what staff believe to be the appropriate, I guess, decision in our opinion, and that would be to not agree to the relief. And I'll try and be succinct, but essentially, there are the 4 properties that are subject of the Anglican diocese are receiving a total of about $8,000 already in municipal and regional taxes relief. So the concern is that the parcel tax essentially allows for the charging of the potential or the actuality of connecting to the service. And all that the regulations say is that only, it says here, in the case of a service that is provided to land or improvements, a parcel tax under this division may be imposed only on parcels that have the opportunity to be provided with the service, whether or not they are in fact being provided with the service. So the argument that the diocese makes is that because this is an old cemetery and is unlikely to ever be needed in terms of the service, that they would request relief. The concern that staff has is essentially that if you do this, if you acquiesce to this, rather modest amount, it'll set a precedent, and then you'll have other, others who are looking to get the same relief. That will ultimately just reduce the numbers that are paying into the service, that provide the capital program, the funding for the capital programs, the renewals required for this service, these services. And at the end of the day, the remainder will pay more. So staff are not supportive of this. I'm just going to be upfront and say that simply because, if council wants to go ahead and request a report, that's the essence of what the report would say. And in the interest of saving time and effort, I'll simply put that forward. And we are of like mind on senior staff. So I'm happy to take whatever questions I can answer.
Excellent. The only question I had is, it says the rector and wardens. What am I too young to know what those are on the letter of request on page 134? I think I know what a warden is, but I'm not sure. Councillor Hillian?
Those are just officials in the Anglican Church, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Okay. There you go. Yeah. Sorry, I was reading it differently. Thanks very much. And we have a couple of questions. Councillor McCullum.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised that we charge frontage fees on this property as, I don't know, I guess I've never really given it any consideration, but I imagine that church-owned cemeteries are not that uncommon in BC, and is that standard practice that they would be charged for water and sewer fees for the frontage fees?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do is turn this over to Trevor Kushner, who's had a lot more experience in these operational matters, I think across BC, certainly on the island. So Trevor, if you could take that question.
Thank you, David, and through the CEO to Mayor and Council. To answer that question specifically, it is quite common. Most churches will pay that frontage charge. And just for a little bit of clarity and maybe some additional information, Council will recall that the user fees are typically used to fund our operations, while frontage fees are used to fund our renewal. It's not just renewal that is fronting the property, it's also the collection of assets like lift stations and force mains that are required to operate the system. In this instance, should council decide to remove that charge, you essentially would just be shifting the burden from their proportionate value. That value would then be shifted to other properties, and other properties would simply just pay more.
Yeah, that seems fairly obvious. This to me seems like a fairly reasonable request given the nature of the property. I wonder if there's a more innovative solution. Maybe it's not waiving the frontage fees, but I mean, I go past this property in the morning on my commute to work, and it's covered in the biggest oak trees in town. It's essentially a park with some, very important historic grave sites, and it surprises me that we're levying any fees against it. It's pretty unique in that way. I think I need like a better understanding of how this would set a precedent when it seems like a one-of-a-kind piece of land in our city.
Mr. Allen?
Yeah, so again, it sounds like you want a staff report, so that's fine. We'll put our minds to that if that's what council wants. The background information which would be included in that is, of course, the legislative requirements that even though the property, I guess we've been told that there is a capability to hook up, even though it seems largely remote. The other option, of course, in the staff report, I can lay it out now, would be that you could use gaming funds to offset the cost. But staff are taking the precautionary principle of saying, maybe there's different situations, economic situations where the applicant is not probably as well heeled, frankly, as the Anglican Diocese of BC. So I guess that's just a decision that council has to make, and then we'll go forth and prepare the report.
Yeah,
Sorry,
just one follow-up comment too. I mean, that stand of trees is so unique in town. And I wonder if there is like a trade-off that could be made, and maybe this is making it too complicated, but if we could have some type of protection, perhaps we could claim carbon credit, or maybe there's some other way that we could make this, a net zero transaction between them and the city. And I don't know what exactly that would look like, but to me, there's so much value in that piece of land staying undisturbed that it's a small amount of money, but over each and every year, I can see that the impact to both them and the city. So I just think it needs a little bit more thought.
Okay, and Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I did have a question. I wasn't sure if I understood right. Is there no water connection here?
I'll turn this over to Trevor.
Yeah, it's my understanding that there is a water connection, just not a sewer connection.
Okay. And so there would be some reason then to pay frontage for water, I suppose. Although I was also curious about, who might this be setting a precedent for? And was there any mention of other organizations that might follow suit with a similar reasoning?
I think it sounds like a staff report, so I'd rather just get the resolution rather than try and bandy together a bunch of responses on the fly here.
Yeah, definitely. Oh yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, well, I mean, I could see going either way. I mean, there's a good argument if they're hooked up to water to charge a water frontage tax. But at the same time, it's such a small property, and yeah, I'll leave it at that and support someone if they want to move that we get a report. Thanks.
Yeah, I think today is really just deciding if we want to get into a report rather than going into the weeds too far. But Councillor Morin.
Thanks, Mayor. It's just a comment. No asking for anything, but I think that it would be good to consider in future just all of these properties that have, frankly, tax breaks or utility breaks, etc. I mean, I drive by these properties, notwithstanding this one with a great grove of trees, which of course we want, but I see a lot of properties that as Mr. Allen stated, there's already 8,000 and something that's waived, where we could be putting housing, or that's just unutilized. And I just think that it is something for a future discussion in terms of people we give, agencies, nonprofits, whatever, who receive breaks, like what does the city get back in return for that? part of a broader conversation. So I just want to put that out there that certainly I've been noticing that a lot lately on my e-bike, Councillor Frisch, a lot of these properties that that are just sitting there dormant and receiving these large tax waivers. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much. Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm in favor of receipt of the letter and no further action. I'll vote against any motion on a staff report. We've received a solid rationale from our staff indicating what would be in a staff report, and I'm not interested in creating additional work for staff at this time. So that's my position on it. Thanks.
Thank you. And Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, Mayor, actually, I was thinking the same thing. I'm happy to essentially, it would be deny this request at this point and not get a staff report on it. And maybe we can address it in future years if it's still an issue for the Anglican Church.
Okay, thanks very much. All right, I don't see any further questions. It is just a letter for receipt, so I'll take that as a unanimous receipt unless somebody waves their hands furiously in opposition. Having said that, I don't see anybody looking to create a motion. So I believe there's only one thing left. Oh, Councillor Hillian.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move that we mandate staff to respond to the Anglican Diocese indicating that we're not willing to accede to their request and explaining the rationale.
Okay. All right, and that's excellent. Mr. Kushner.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add that part of that response could also be in the rationale for not making or agreeing to this refund is the fact that we're entering into a rates review for water and sewer for both connection charges and for frontage fees. So I think that'll really inform council's decision making in the future.
Appreciate that very much. Councillor McCollum.
Did I have my hand up?
You did, but that's okay.
I'm good, thanks.
All right. This is a decision, so I'll poll council, starting with Councillor Cole-Hamilton.
In favor.
Councillor Frisch.
In favor.
Councillor Hillian.
In favor.
Councillor McCollum.
In favor.
Councillor Morin.
In favor.
Councillor Theos.
I'm in favor.
And I'll be in favor as well, so that'll be unanimous. All right. Thanks, Councillor Hillian, for putting that motion forward. So I think that gives staff good direction. And back. What was that, Councillor Frisch?
Move adjournment.
Second.
Awesome. Anyone opposed to adjournment? I don't see anybody waving their hands. So thanks very much. I think we will call this meeting adjourned.
Thanks, Mayor.